Hailing from New England and drawing from its imagery and vitality, author and poet Mary McLaughlin Slechta paints an intricate picture of Black American life in her new book of short vignettes, Mulberry Street Stories. Written heartfully with wit and charm, these acclaimed shorts explore the joy, wonder, and devastation that lives among the residents of Mulberry Street. Recipient of the 2021 Kimbilio Award, Slechta's talent shines through in a lyricism that takes the beauty and hardship of the everyday and makes it magical. Mary McLaughlin Slechta, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Jessica. Appreciate that.
So I want to start this by having you kind of talk about and explain the Mulberry Street Stories.
It's a collected set of stories that are connected in small ways and in big ways. There are storylines that are connected. There's characters that reappear among the stories. But the main thing is that I based it on all the neighborhoods I've lived in, but in particular the neighborhood I lived in and where I live now, which happened during the pandemic. And that was looking out of the window and imagining lives inside of those houses. So there's a lot of where I come from in this book.
And so what drove you to sort of have these overlapping stories and characters in a series of like separate stories instead of just like one collective novel?
Well, that's a good question because in a way, I wouldn't have written this except that I have been writing a novel, and I got sort of stuck with the novel, and I thought I need some more experience working in like small pieces, which is more familiar to me. So I stepped back from the novel and I started looking at smaller lives and how they might be connected rather than the big, lumbering novel that I'm working on.
And you have quite a history with poetry, right?
Yes.
Is that sort of your origin?
Yeah, most of my life has been writing and performing poetry.
Okay, so what drove this transition into stories?
Because I always wanted to write stories, but I got very busy. I had a couple of kids, and writing fiction takes a little bit longer. I did write fiction, but poetry was just a little easier, and also it's very emotional. It really is cathartic, and it was right for the time.
Mm-hmm. And so you have these separate stories, but again, there's so much overlap and so much sort of crisscrossing, and you'll have one character with who's like the protagonist of one story, but then they appear briefly in someone else's story.
Yes,
and it's really fun to sort of connect those dots because there's no clear like linear timeline. You're kind of working across time and space and perspective, and it weaves together beautifully, but you have to do the work to sort of puzzle it together. And so I'm wondering what sort of drove you to have some of these in like first person versus second person versus third? Because there is one that is in second person. And I'm interested in what made you choose that.
Well, first, if I could answer why they all tend to overlap, it's because that's intentional. When I look out of my window where I live, I see cracks in the street, saying we're not in the fanciest part of town. And part of my imagination during that quarantine period, not just watching who was going in and out of their homes and imagining their lives, but also I started to just have this idea that, how neighborhoods are, that they're always there. Prior neighborhoods and new neighborhoods. Neighborhoods are always changing, but they're kind of layered on top of each other, so that I did want to disrupt the timeline, and I wanted some of the Mulberry Street versions to bleed into the other ones. So that's part of just sort of the imagination taking over. I just experimenting and having some fun with that. My other novel that I've written was actually a choose-your-own-adventure, a game-style book, so that it's all in second person. So I think I kind of flashed back to that period of my life when I spent like 2 years writing that. It was a lot of fun, but it was crazy, and it's always in second person. So you imagine yourself within that person's life. Yeah.
I like that chapter. It's very close to the end. It might even be second to last, where you are speaking directly to the audience, and it feels more confrontational. It's very direct in the messaging that you've sort of been hinting at throughout the book. And it's interesting because up until that point, you have so many people with varying perspectives. They love Mulberry Street. They don't like it. They want to be away, but they keep coming back. And so there's a lot of contradiction and a lot of sort of like just varying perspectives. And so this is sort of a moment of confrontation or like saying like, here's what's important to hold on to. And I guess I'm wondering if you do have any essential like takeaways from these stories that you do want people to get.
Yes, I do. Yeah, I would hope to, and thank you for explaining that, describing that so well. Part of what was happening in those 2 years when we were all like quarantined was George Floyd, mass protests on the television, feeling certain helplessness about what was going on in the world, in that sense that deja vu all over again, as the saying goes, and that things were happening and repeating, and so I just had this notion that people on Mulberry Street had seen it and done it all and just were really kind of fed up but kind of beaten down, but yet looking for any kind of hope. And I hope that the stories together leave people with hope. There's like a fairy tale in the beginning, and at the end, someone is coming home from prison, and he thinks he's going to be hated, and he's ready to basically finish his life on the North Pole, but he doesn't. There's a meal waiting for him, and there's food throughout the book, and I did that deliberately, I think, because I do like food in books, but there's a lot of smells and a lot of delicious cakes, and there's foods that people eat and prepare for each other.
There's also a lot of birds, I've noticed.
Yes, yeah.
I'm wondering why, sparrows in particular, why there are so many.
Well, there are a lot of birds on my street. Yeah.
Do they have any significant meaning for you personally?
Oh, I just find them very interesting. I miss them. There haven't been too many in the last year, but especially the sparrows. There are a lot of little sparrows and old overgrown hedges in my neighborhood, and so little sparrows are in and out. And I grew up in the country, and I love birds.
There's also fire. There's a significant sort of the symbol of fire and sort of the traces that it leaves, the scars that it leaves.
Yes,
and I'm wondering why you chose to have fire as sort of this opportunity for rebirth, or like sort of a phoenix rising from the ashes, Well,
I guess I have to say that I spend a lot of time watching the news. I'm really a news junkie. And one of the other stories that came out during the quarantine, as we're sitting there and we're all feeling like, what can we do and where could we go and all of this, the story of Tulsa, Oklahoma was all in the news a lot. I don't know if that was a direct influence on me, but when I look back, I think it must have been somehow, but that I wanted to look at people who were living this kind of fire, but carrying them through, like what kind of stories come out of that, so that there's somebody who's a grifter, who comes out of that fire experience and he's trying to rip people off. But there are also people who are good people who are trying to help their neighbors and do things for each other. There's a vampire, of course, who is trying to overcome the injuries that he sustained from the fire.
Let's talk more about you drawing from your real life experiences. This street, Mulberry Street, is set in the Northeast. It doesn't specify exactly where, but you grew up in the Northeast, New England, and I'm wondering why set it there? What is so special about a place like that?
Well, yeah, I grew up in a neighborhood in the same house in rural Connecticut, and when I was writing poetry, I think that's one of the big inspirations that I had, because I saw that neighborhood really sort of disappear. Basically, the neighborhood disappeared, and so that influenced me a lot. But I've been living in Syracuse, New York, for about 40 years now, and at some point you have to say, I guess this is my home now. So it became more of an urban story. But I will say that a lot of those things that happened or the feelings, I did borrow from that real sadness that happens when you see a neighborhood disappear, and you see people pass away, people move on, tragedies of all kinds, good things as well, but it's sort of something I wanted to comment on.
I drew a lot of comparisons to thriving streets and cities, like black neighborhoods that had done well and then ultimately fell because of
white intervention or just a series of systems working against them. And so you have like Beale Street, you have my grandmother spent time in Mound Bayou in Mississippi, and she grew up in Gary, Indiana, and there's Detroit and even St. Louis. Like there are these strong histories of Black economic growth that eventually just fall to the wayside, and what's left is just abandonment. And so I connected, while this is set in this specific area, it's so countrywide, and it's really interesting to see all of the ways that it's sort of permeated across the country.
Yeah, I live in a neighborhood that was redlined and then gentrified and all of that. So yeah, those kind of issues are really just kind of directly affecting me. And some of the things, unfortunately, in the story are like snatched right out of real life. Like there's a swastika that's painted on a house in one of the stories, and that's something that we actually faced as a neighborhood. So I put that in there. I think sometimes people may recognize it, at least local people might know it, or people on my street might know it. But I thought that was important to bring that into the story. But I also want to say that as I was editing and going through it, I made a discovery that I didn't realize, that I was more interested and curious about people coming up from the South than I'd ever realized. My own history, my mother and her family came from Sanford, Florida in the mid-1930s. And a lot of people actually from Sanford, Florida, ended up coming to Syracuse. So there was this kind of a strange connection. And with that, and one of my baby pictures, my mother always said, that's us, that we're in Syracuse. So I never imagined that I would go live there, but that feeling that these are transplants like my mother really started to influence the stories. So as I continue, I hope there's going to be a Mulberry Street Stories too. That theme has really struck with me.
I guess having so many residents of Mulberry Street as people or descendants of people who came from the South, are you incorporating a sort of like Southern influence? Is that
yes,
part of it?
I am, but I don't know too much about the South because my mother's experience, she was a little girl, and it was a very bitter kind of leaving, I think, because she was a child and she probably had playmates. It's sort of those questions you don't ask and you wish you had before your parent passes away. And I sort of filling in the blanks a little bit with that, from what the little bits and pieces of the stories that she told, but she didn't like to talk about going to the South except to say, don't go back. And so it was very traumatic that way. That's why there's a story in there with I don't want to give it away, but the family that comes up, and they're very conflicted about, is it going to be better or not? But they end up on Mulberry Street, so that's a little bit better.
Yeah. Speaking of Mulberry Street being a better place, it's full of magic. The way that you write is so magical, and I want to know how you feel about the magic of the everyday in our time, and if you feel like it's still there with us.
Yeah. I very much feel like it's still with us, and it really is a part of my mother's story when she came up and with her huge family of her brothers and of different ages, and people trickled northward. A lot of stories in the family about magic, about magical happenings. My father comes from Jamaica, and so there was a lot of magical stories there too. So I've always been a big believer in fairy tales, and I thought that Mulberry Street should have its fairy tales too.
And going back to the way that you write this magic, there's a playfulness and a silliness in the beginning especially, and the way that you write, things aren't laid out or directly explained. There's a lot of, it's a bit cryptic, to sort of like read between the lines and understand what's being said. And I'm interested, I guess, in the way that you write deliberately and how you sort of like come to incorporate this magic in the words themselves.
I think maybe it's because of the poetry that's how I write poetry. It always seems very straightforward to me, and I always say, oh, this is very clear. And people say, no, it's not really that clear. It's kind of a little cryptic. But I think that has to be the influence of writing poetry for so long. But there was a point as I was writing the stories when, as I told you, I was really experimenting and having a lot of fun, that I didn't want to tell the whole story because I wanted to leave spaces for the reader's imagination, so that there's my favorite love story in the book, but you never know how the two people meet. There's at one point, Sparrow is born. She's a little baby, and found in a little garden, and then suddenly she's a little girl picking eggplants, and she's given a house. And the next thing you know, she's later on in the book, her partner is the vampire who lived in the house. So, and I wanted to leave that there for the imagination. How did these two people meet? And I did actually write stories that explained all that. And then I thought, nah, I really wanted that magic to happen, and it's up to your imagination to think about it.
Well, and it's really gratifying too when you leave this room for people to connect the dots themselves. Like when there was a lot for me of flipping back and forth to make sure this person was this person, and sort of like doing that work to connect the dots. And it's gratifying and exciting to be like, oh my God, this is this person, and to sort of figure that out. So I think you leave a lot of room for people to have fun with it too.
Oh, I'm glad you said that. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
I had a lot of fun with Nell, that character, the little girl who's, I shouldn't say this, but like very much like my mom, kind of a little grumbly little girl, pinching her brother and everything, because she becomes, as you probably figured out, the older woman later in the story who has Alzheimer's. Yeah. And I had a lot of fun with that, to imagine and write about it, but then to take that back to not include it in the final book.
Yeah, and I like too that you have sort of playing into that cryptic nature. You've got this being that follows Nell and her little brother Jackie, and it's always there, and Jackie is always aware of it and trying to protect his girlfriend from that, and it's a way to talk about oppressive forces, and the way that it's sort of embodied in this like figure, in this being. So the chasm. I would love to hear more about, at the end of the block, at the bottom of the hill, when you hit Oak, you've got this chasm, and kids are disappearing, and there's this big gap in cracks. You talk about cracks in your own experience, and I would love to hear, I guess, more about what that means for you.
Well, over those 40 years, it's probably been 30, I've lived in my neighborhood. I've seen so many kids who disappear or go to prison, or we just aren't really sure. In any neighborhood, especially in city neighborhoods maybe, people don't tell you their whole stories. You meet people out on the sidewalk, especially in Syracuse winter. You see people when you're shoveling, and then you don't see them so much until the summer comes. But I look at the news, and we see children going off to prison or being killed. And I wanted to talk about those children, but I didn't want to do it in the way that we normally think about it, because it just leads us to the next incident that happens that's really sad. So I started to think that something magical might happen, so that there's this, but it also works because there is a chasm at the bottom of our street that it's not actually a dead end if I'm visualizing it, but people disappear all the time, and where do they go? And if they manage to get over that chasm, what does their future look like? And that roll call that happens in the saddest part of the day when the parents call the names of the missing children, it just sort of it chokes me up. I can say that about my own book, but that part really chokes me up because it really made me, as a human being, really care so deeply about people I'll never know, people in the news, and their families that are left without them, probably doing exactly that, making food for them, thinking about them, keeping their beds. So I wanted us to think about them as individuals as much as I could, the missing people. I should say, too, that I was a teacher, and I live in Syracuse is such a place that I could walk to school. I worked in middle school. I worked in the high school. Could walk to either one of those places. So I really got to know children pretty well, and their habits and their comings and their goings and their disappearings and the tragedies that their parents feel when they are no longer there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You do have a character, an unhoused man who has a sign that just says hope on it. And it's interesting you talk about wanting to talk about the disappearance of children without stating it explicitly, because these aren't things that we need to necessarily relive all the time, especially in the context of fairy tales. It's like, how do we confront this without, I guess, bringing ourselves back to that dark place?
Exactly,
And you really incorporate the sense of hope even when discussing something so hard.
I have to admit that in the original draft, it was a darker story, so thank goodness for editors like David Haynes from Kimbilio, who I worked with the first year, and he gave me some suggestions on how I might begin it and end it, but I think I was, like so many of us, in a darker place a few years ago, but I started to understand the sense of that, so I will say that, I'll admit that, sometimes it was even hard as I was writing them to maintain hope.
One of your characters, Nell, toward the end with Alzheimer's, she doesn't really have the recollection that she used to have. And when Toni Morrison is brought up, who I absolutely see as an influence here for you, there's a tribute kind of in one of the stories where Toni Morrison is mentioned, and then Nell states that she is Toni Morrison. And I wanted to talk about sort of the importance that particularly older matriarchs in Black communities, the sort of influence and power they have, and them being the griots of a family or a community, and providing stories that would otherwise not be continued through generations. And, we have our own Toni Morrisons within our own families, and it's a gift, and
Really
I guess I just wanted to hear more of your thoughts on having someone like that.
Okay, thanks. My mother, I know, was the griot of our family. She passed away this year, and that's why the book is dedicated to her. It would have been anyways, but it's dedicated to her. And we used to, the very first story that I ever published was about was back in the 70s, I think, or no, maybe the 80s, and it tells about the story of my mother and I going into Hartford, Connecticut, and I was getting my first haircut, and I'll leave it at that. It's a long story, but something uncomfortable happened, and I remember my mother reading it. She said, "That's not how it happened," and she was insistent. So there's a danger in a griot, or there's a challenge to me, I should say, because my mother was very much about, this is the way things should be, and this is the way that happened. So she's very much that character of Nell as an older woman is very much like my mother, pushing for the truth. And this is, and then this happened, and then that happened. But what happens when you have Alzheimer's and that starts to break apart? And that's one of the tragedies, I think, of that disease, another layer of the tragedy there. And you mentioned older African-American women starting to relive trauma. So my mother would say things about her past, but we weren't quite sure if it had really happened or not. But it really traumatized her, and it traumatized us too, as somebody who takes care of her. We couldn't tell reality from fiction, but that's kind of like life, isn't it? It's like this whole idea of what is true and what isn't true, and did it really matter if she didn't remember the facts correctly because the feelings were there? Right. So we would have to calm her down and relax her.
Yeah. Are you writing anything else right now?
Well, I'm back to the novel that I've been working on, which is total fairy tale, which is fun. I just really love writing in that vein, but I'm not done with Mulberry Street. It's just these. Not even these particular characters, but the theme that I mentioned earlier of people just moving from the South and coming to the North, people looking for some kind of escape, some kind of hope. But this one, I don't know if you picked up that Jackie Wilson is a big feature. I listened to Jackie Wilson constantly when I was writing this, and now I'm listening to The Fifth Dimension. So I'm just sort of stuck into that time period. But the idea of just sort of, up and away. My beautiful balloon.
Yeah. Thank you for sitting down with me.
Thank you.